Yeah, I think we're all set. Good evening, everyone, and my name is David Elwood, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum here at Harvard University. This is one of those special nights that we have here because it is the time we have the Malcolm Weiner Lecture, and it's special first and most because we have a remarkable speaker, but it's also special because Malcolm Weiner, for whom this is named and who provides the resources to make it happen, is here. And Malcolm had been a good friend and a generous supporter of the school and of mine for a long time. Indeed, I do believe I was the first Malcolm Weiner professor. Is that true? Yeah, I think Mary Jo Bain and I were the first Malcolm Weiner professors here, and so it's a source of great honor. But if there was ever someone you would define as a Renaissance man, Malcolm Weiner is that person. Not only is he interested in issues such as social policy, indeed, he's the source of endowment for the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy. He also is really one of the very world's leading experts on Greek antiquities. He wins prizes. He has journals devoted to his work. He receives honorary degrees around the world there. He's also one of the great thinkers on foreign policy. He was just today down meeting with Porter Goss at the CIA. He's also someone who understands economic issues in a very deep and fundamental sense. And indeed, international economic issues was something that he thought needed attention at this institution long before many people recognized just how critical it is. And so it's particularly fitting that this particular lecture series should be held here. Speakers have included Helmut Kohl, James Schlesinger, Václav Klaus, and most recently Martin Wolf, Leon Britton, others. And so it's a great tradition to welcome Malcolm here as our guest along with his wife and daughter. So let's give a hand to Malcolm. She, by the way, is a remarkable civil servant and public servant in her own right as well. Tonight's speaker, Pete Peterson, is the senior chairman and co-founder of the Blackstone Group, and he has a very impressive career that includes a long tenure as CEO of Lehman Brothers and chairman and CEO of Lehman Brothers Kuhn Loeb Inc. He's been a director of many corporations, Sony, Federated Department Stores, Black & Decker, and so forth. But he's also been a remarkable public servant. He was for example, was the Secretary of Commerce during the Nixon administration, and I've already heard a few good stories about that period. But Time Magazine called him the most powerful Secretary of Commerce since Herbert Hoover. Now, I don't think he's planning on running for president yet, but maybe it's a possibility. I think there's much to be done. It's a very long history of government involvement, but his service did not end with his remarkable tenure at the Secretary of Commerce. He's also went on to serve as the chair of a number of federal commissions, the National Commission on Productivity, U.S.-Soviet Commercial Commission. Most recently, he served as chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. But in some ways, even more impressive to me are the organizations that he's participated in, helped found, been chair of, and so forth. For example, the Institute for International Economics, a remarkable organization that he's a chairman and founding chairman of, which does cover a lot of the very critical issues around international economics, as well as anyone around. He's president of the Concord Coalition, Council on Foreign Relations, and many, many other organizations. But what impresses me even more about Pete Peterson is his vision and his courage and his capacity to talk about the grand issues and important issues of the day. One of the greatest challenges I see facing democracy and nations around the world is, frankly, a willingness to do the hard things that are obvious to everyone. It is an extraordinary moment. We've just gone through this set of issues around Katrina. No one who's ever visited New Orleans didn't know those levees were a problem, didn't understand. FEMA and others had practice for that very catastrophe, and yet no one had done what it took to somehow protect the city. And now we're going to spend vastly more money and perhaps create yet the same problem over again because we didn't have the simple vision and courage to look at that. This is repeated over and over and over again, and the kinds of things that are out there, they're as clear as the nose on our faces, and yet our democracies often are unable to take a look at them. When we do take a look at them, it's usually because some remarkable person, man or woman, has the courage and the wisdom and the credibility and, frankly, the charisma to really point it out and show us. And that's a lot of what P. Peterson has done in all kinds of different ways. His book entitled Gray Dawn, for example, was one of the very earliest to really talk about the consequences of an aging world population and what it would mean. And indeed, talk about charisma, it was described as attention-getting as an air raid siren. Paul Volcker, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve book, said about that book, Peterson's book demonstrates with conviction and eloquence the need to recognize that we face a social, political, and economic time bomb in the aging of America, of every industrialized country. The bomb can be diffused, but only if we summon up the will to act. The book explains the options clearly and forcibly for political leaders and citizens alike. And now he has another book, Running on Empty. And this book is talking about some of the things associated with the demographics, but much larger set of financial and other economic crises that we absolutely have to deal with. And what is striking about his work is the clear-sightedness, the lack of a partisan point of view. At times in reading his books, you can't tell, was he from the Republican Party, Democratic Party, whatever. It's just wisdom. It's just sensibilities. It's something that's desperately lacking in this time. This book has been praised also by practitioners and critics alike. And so we have before us a very remarkable man who is a fitting tribute to Malcolm Weiner's remarkable vision in setting this up. And so I very much look forward to hearing Pete Peterson's thoughts about both the crises we face and how we can possibly actually act in time this time. Ladies and gentlemen, Pete Peterson.
Thank you. Dean, I particularly appreciate your mentioning my books. I desperately need the sales. And you know, if any of you get in the business world and you're pretentious enough to write books, you have to be prepared for searing roasts by various characters. My favorite roaster is my dear friend Ted Sorensen. About Gray Dawn, he said, Gray Dawn is a book that once you put it down, you won't be able to pick it up. I couldn't wait for his attack on Running Empty. A day after it appeared, he said, Pete, when I read the title, Running on Empty, I'd assumed it was an autobiography. Every time I hear this comment about being the most powerful secretary since Herbert Hoover, I tend to laugh. In the first place, we all know what happened to Herbert Hoover. And in the second place, anybody that's had the Commerce job knows that there's never been a powerful Secretary of Commerce. So it's an oxymoron, and I've been collecting them ever since, about 50 of them that might be more interesting than what I'm about to say. My favorite at the moment is the House Ethics Committee. I'm very much honored to be associated with Malcolm Weiner and Carolyn Seeley. Malcolm and Carolyn, how in turn you're going to feel about this association with me, we'll leave till later, but I deeply appreciate this opportunity. I've decided to put some charts together to make it less painful, but first I'd like to begin with 3 caveats. First, this presentation or lecture is not about the short term. By and large, it's in reasonably good shape, and you get enough of those forecasts anyway. It's about the long term. And I believe one of the most serious afflictions of our economy, our political economy, is we have an aggravated case of short-termitis. And I think it's long past due, as the Dean suggested, that we start confronting some of the obvious and daunting challenges. And I'm going to focus on some of those. I think it's also time, Dean, that we ask yourself a rather awkward question. which is, has our political economy reached the point that is so oriented to all gain and no pain and all get and no give, combined with a short-term orientation, that is considered politically suicidal for anybody to ever suggest that anybody give up anything for the long-term future? And that, to me, is a question that justifies very serious study. At a time when we're dealing with an Iraq war, as I'm going to point out to you, unthinkable deficits of various types, Katrina, the only sacrifice I'm being asked to make is that I accept my income tax cut to be permanent. That's a joke. And that I got to get rid of my estate tax. And that's the sacrifice that I'm being asked to make. Second, I'm not going to make any specific predictions because it's dangerous. And besides that, I think the world has gotten so new and so complicated, the global economy, that it's getting increasingly difficult to make predictions. In particular, there are massive amounts of global capital that are now sloshing around the world, and we really don't understand, in my view, all of the motivations for sloshing around. Some are economic, some are political, like supporting jobs. Some are because they don't think there are other alternatives, but we have, Alan Greenspan's obviously much smarter than I am. So when he says it's a conundrum, I assume it is a conundrum, which is why are long-term interest rates as low as they are at the present time in the face of all these challenges? Finally, this is going to sound Jeremiah-like, but I don't mean it to be all Jeremiah. I think as we contemplate some of these challenges that I'm going to discuss with you, we ought to also focus on the huge advantages that we have and the fact that other countries are facing challenges that are in some ways as daunting or perhaps more daunting than ours. We have a highly deregulated economy, we have a highly competitive economy, we have a far more entrepreneurial economy, we have a far more resilient economy. And I wouldn't trade living anywhere else for living here, and I want to make that point, but that doesn't make the challenges any less daunting. If I can have the first slide, please. I'm going to talk about the Triad Deficits because I think they are interrelated. I'm talking about the budget deficits, short-term and long-term. I'm talking about the current account or foreign deficits. And very important, I'm talking about the savings deficit because I think these three problems need to be thought of together and solved together. Next chart, please. Short-term, over the next 5 years, we've been hearing for months now that the deficit is going to be cut in half. I don't know of a serious person that believed that. With Katrina, it's now ridiculous to think this deficit's going to be cut in half, particularly when we take the point of view that entitlements is off the budget, is off consideration, defense is off consideration, and now Katrina. And the arithmetic just doesn't work. Next, on the 10-year outlook. The Concord Coalition, if I can have the next chart, please. Maybe we do have it. Is this deficit number one? Yes. The Concord Coalition, Goldman Sachs, the Committee for Economic Development has gotten together and made their own projections. It was amazing how closely they came to each other. The estimate is about $5 trillion over the next 10 years. I want to remind you, next chart please, over the 10-year period, Social Security for the next 10 years will be running a $1 trillion surplus, which is reducing the apparent side of the budget deficit. But beginning shortly thereafter, it turns heavily into deficit. Next chart, please. Soon after the boomers retire in spades, it goes in the opposite direction from very large surpluses to very large deficits. For example, by 2030, the estimate now just for Social Security is about $250 billion in annual deficits. Next chart, please. I've often fantasized that we have a honest politician, which may be another oxymoron, I don't know, who said to us when they discussed the long-term fiscal situation, it's entitlement, stupid, because that is where the big money is. How big? All of you are sophisticated people here. You know all about unfunded liabilities. Forget all this talk about trust fund and so forth. These liabilities are not funded, and they are massive. If you use the same method the Bush administration uses, the infinite horizon method, the aggregate unfunded liabilities is $74 trillion. That's over $500,000 for every working American. The next estimate that you use, the 75 years, suggests about $45 trillion. The point is our entire net worth as a country is only $42 trillion. So these are massive liabilities, promises we've made. Let's look at the next chart, please. How big is the spending increase? Over the next 35 years, it's expected to increase by 9% of the GDP. That's roughly three times larger, just the increase, that our defense budget has been for some time. Next chart, please. The Concord Coalition, using what I consider at least to be reasonable projections, entitlement spending and interest will consume the entire budget by 2020, only 15 years, not leaving a penny for anything else. I've often wondered if it might be cute and naughty to say to the Congress, you have passed Sarbanes-Oxley about the appropriate funding of pensions. You've set up the ERISA laws, which say that you can't fund pensions in more than 30 years. Why don't you apply that to the federal budget? If you do that, as this next chart shows you, next chart please, it would add $1.5 trillion at least to the annual budget deficit if we honestly reported it. In other words, if these characters were to apply these laws to themselves, they'd all be in jail. Some people offer the rather simple-minded approach. Let's just get rid of those damn Bush tax cuts, and that'll take care of everything. The next chart shows you how big the tax cuts are, even if you eliminated all of them, compared to the growth in entitlement spending. Now, I don't know of a politician's recommending getting rid of all of them. It tends to be for fat cats like myself and Malcolm and a few others in this room. But even if we were, it only covers about 1/9 of the increase in spending. Now, we're endlessly told by the politicians that the Social Security Trust Fund will keep everything solvent until 2042. And one of our difficulties is that people really believe that, and most people do. You can understand why their enthusiasm for making any changes is pretty restrained. So let's talk about this Social Security Trust Fund. The next chart, please. I consider it an ultimate fiscal oxymoron. It shouldn't be trusted and it's not funded. Other than that, it's perfectly appropriate. With or without trust funds, we have to confront three tough choices that no one wants to talk about. We either borrow the money, we increase taxes, or we cut the benefits. Now, a lot of people say to me, well, you just don't understand. The full faith and credit of the United States is behind this. And I say, yeah, it may be behind it, but you still have to borrow the money. So the next chart, I try to show how much we would have to borrow. Now, it's very important as we look at these entitlement programs to understand they're pay-as-you-go, and therefore we should be looking at cash flows if we want to be responsible. How much would we have to borrow between 2018 and 2042 just for Social Security to cover the deficits once the boomers start retiring? It's $5.4 trillion in inflation-adjusted dollars. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't meet my definition of solvency that we're endlessly told the system is. Now, what if we try to handle it through taxes? Next chart, please. Payroll taxes for Social Security are about 10.9%. They would have to go up to 17, as you know, as you can see here. And remember, every politician is saying the middle class needs to have their taxes cut. Payroll taxes would fall very heavily on the middle class. That's the order of magnitude of that. Now, the third alternative, next chart please, is to cut benefits, and let's talk about that. First, for those of you who don't follow this dull subject, I find most Americans are not aware of the way the Social Security system is set up. Most Americans know that the benefits go up with 100% inflation. They do not know that it also goes up with the average increase in wages. And therefore, just the wage indexing accounts for a big amount, 30% of the increase in the cost, as you can see here. Now, what Margaret Thatcher did in 1980, and Great Britain is the only developed country in the world that on the Social Security program is in very good shape. She eliminated wage indexing and just had inflation indexing, and that essentially solved the problem for Great Britain. Now, next chart, please. First, some basics about wage indexing, some variation of which I strongly favor. Wage indexing makes it very difficult to grow out of the problem. Why? Because as the economy grows, the wages grow, and therefore the costs of the benefits goes up. Next chart, please. I can find it here. If you eliminated wage indexing, here is what would be achieved. You'd eliminate all of these long-term deficits I talked about and the need for any tax increases. In fact, you'd end up over time with some surplus, and I would propose that this money be used for the poor in ways I can explain. Next chart. It has no effect on the current retirees because they get the same benefits, inflation index that they get now. Next chart, please. Children and the parents get the same benefits. And there's some serious moral problems, I think, between kids and parents when the kids understand that we're slipping the check to them for our free lunch. And next chart, please. The safety net is preserved, certainly for those who need it. Now, the next chart explains a basic reality. There are no free lunches here in any solution, and there are no free lunches with wage indexing. Because if you eliminate wage indexing, because wages rise faster, obviously, than inflation, over time, wage indexing means that beneficiaries are going to get a smaller and smaller share of their pre-retirement earnings. Next chart. Bob Posen. Is Bob with your school, or is it? Excuse me, I should have known. Bob Posen, who I believe was at Harvard, is the author of something called progressive indexing, which is kind of getting rid of the wage indexing for people like me and having something approaching more of a means-tested thing. I think the proposal has quite a lot to say for it. But it does only solve about 70% of the problem. So the next chart, please. So if you want to really solve the Social Security problem, you're going to have to do something beyond the progressive indexing, which might be increasing retirement age. I think we have to, if we do that, we better index it to longevity, because if you think the numbers I'm presenting are daunting, imagine people live 10 years longer. Now, while my enthusiasm for much of what this administration does is very restrained, I must say. Maybe one of the reasons I don't know who I am is I don't know who I am, because I'm very disenchanted with what I see going on there. But we should at least give the president credit for putting something on the table. Bob Kerrey, who's the senator and co-chairman of the Concord Coalition, I said, "Hey, Bob, where is the Democratic plan?" And he says, "You haven't heard of the Democratic plan?" I said, "Gee, I read a lot about these." Yeah. I said, "Really? What is it?" He said, "We call it the do-nothing plan." I said, "Okay, I understand." Now, here's some questions about these personal accounts that you heard so much about that I think deserve to be asked. First of all, I think we better ask, are these accounts funded with new savings? Or are we going to borrow the money for them? And even if you take a more gradual program, we'd need to borrow $754 billion over the next decade and nearly $8 trillion over the following decades if we borrow the money. And it's my view, as I'm going to point out in a minute, that this society is confronted with some dysfunctional, dangerous dependence on foreign capital. And the idea that we would announce glibly in the face of record current account deficits that we're going to borrow another $8 trillion strikes me as pretty irresponsible. I also get very troubled by this argument that let's just borrow it all and everything will be fine, because if it were that simple, namely that stocks are going to outperform bonds regardless of how much you borrow, why don't we put thousands in everybody's accounts and everybody can be Joe Millionaire? So I think the problem is much more complicated than just borrowing the money. The next chart, please. I think the questions that should be asked about some of these private accounts, which I favor if they were indeed funded, is what do they really do about long-term sustainability of the system? That is, about the unfunded liabilities, And the answer is, by themselves, they do nothing to solve that problem, or virtually nothing. Another question is, what do they do to increase national savings? Well, again, until we either cut benefits or increase taxes, we're not doing anything to increase national savings. We're simply increasing the borrowing. Next chart, please. This may be very surprising for an alleged Republican like me, but I've concluded that our society, with its consumption obsession and borrowing obsession, has reached the point where if we really want to increase savings in the near future, we're going to have to do it in a mandatory way. And I know that stuns a lot of my Republican friends, but let me tell you why I have arrived at that conclusion. I was asked by the White House and the Congress about 10 years ago to chair a committee on capital formations on savings. I got some of the best savings economists in America, one or two from Harvard, MIT, Stanford, and so forth. And I observed that our savings rate is going down, and I said, I'd like an appraisal from you of all of our so-called tax incentives, and what are they doing for national savings? Much to my surprise, even though I had Republicans, Democrats, independents, advisors here, they were virtually unanimous that these incentives have only a marginal effect. I said, why is that? And they said, because many of the people who use them would have saved anyway, and the cost of the incentive reduces the amount of net savings that you get. So I said, what are you saying to me? You're saying we have to increase savings for 100 reasons. They said, well, we're saying that the society has reached the point where if you're really serious, you're going to have to do what Singapore, Australia, and Chile did. I became persuaded, the next chart, and therefore in my book I propose 2 to 3% of pay.
I think you're off by one chart.
All right. We have the next chart then?
Is that right, or is that one?
Well, yeah, probably. Could I have the next chart, please? Yeah, that's fine. I propose 2 to 3% of pay, mandatory program kept out of the hands of the government with some subsidies for the low-wage earners. I propose that this money, next chart please, be put into globally indexed fixed income and equity accounts for diversification, but for other reasons. It dramatically reduces administrative costs. You avoid problems with investor imprudence. And you avoid Washington beginning to define what a correct and incorrect industry might be. While I'm on Wall Street, and some of my Wall Street teams are salivating over private accounts, I can assure you that if we started having individual accounts managed by Wall Street, the costs would be extraordinary for the size of these accounts and dramatically reduce the returns they all talk about. Next chart, please. So I arrive at two basic conclusions. Number one, that spending reductions will need to play the major role. And second, next chart, that we should seize this opportunity to increase personal savings, which are at a historical level, as I will show you. Now, you know, all the talk is about Social Security. And the truth of the matter is that there's a much bigger elephant in the boudoir that we all pretend we don't see and hope nobody else is rude enough to mention, which is Medicare. Earlier I showed you the size of the unfunded liabilities of entitlements. Next chart, please. You may be stunned to see that of the $74 trillion of unfunded liabilities, 62 trillion are Medicare. So in aggregate terms, it's a problem. Forget all the political philosophic questions, about 5 times or more bigger. Next chart, how much would we have to raise taxes? We'd have to raise taxes here much more than we would on Social Security. And the Social Security Administration predicts that my 5 kids and grandkids, if we decided to finance it with payroll taxes, would have to pay 38% of pay to cover Social Security and Medicare. Now, I just think that's an unthinkable thing to inflict on our children. Now, if we're going to do anything about Medicare, we're going to confront some issues that our politicians don't even dare raise. But since I'm not running for office and would have very little success if I did, I can raise some of the awkward questions. Number one, next chart, please. How will an aging world make the trade-offs between health care and other health care priorities and other national priorities? For example, if we're going to reduce some of these costs, there's some very profound questions being raised. How much should we spend on the end of life, and how much should we spend on our children, for example, as one issue? As between the trade-off between health care and other priorities, everybody is yakking about the need for investment in education and R&D to compete with Chinese and Indians who are producing several times more engineers than we are. How are we going to get the resources to do that? So there's a very serious and tough question about resource allocation. Next question. Our people have gotten used to what is called an open-ended cost-plus system. As a result, our costs are rising in the healthcare area much more than the economy. So here too, for different reasons, we're not going to grow out of the Medicare problem as much as we may wish that we could. Now here's some tough issues. Next chart, please. We're going to have to confront. My dear friend on the Concord Coalition, Dan Yankelovich, has done studies of healthcare versus other government programs. He said we've gotten in this country into what he calls the maximum right mode, and that if anybody has an ailment, they are quote unquote entitled to whatever the latest high-cost, high-tech technique is. That's a fundamental issue when it comes to healthcare. The next chart. Well, before you do the next chart, go back just one. Tell you a little story. The state of Oregon many years ago, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, was confronted with Medicaid costs that the state absorbs half of and was going broke. And they had to do something. They did a highly communitarian democratic experiment. They got nurses, doctors, priests, CEOs, lawyers, labor unions, et cetera, together. And they said, it's clear we can't do everything we're going to do, so what are we going to give up? And these fine people had the courage to list the 718 what are called DRGs, or diagnostic related groups, which define all of the symptoms and conditions that people get Medicare for. And they actually listed them in terms of priority. And at the low end of priority would be, I suppose, getting a liver transplant for an 85-year-old alcoholic, or I've forgotten what they were, but you get the point. Now, the next chart, if I can. The brute reality, the question that never is raised, is we're going to probably require that some people give up some medical procedures that might have some medical benefit. And that raises the issue of healthcare rationing. Now, when the Oregon people proposed this program, which I thought took tremendous courage, it went to the Bush 1 White House. And they said, oh my God, that's rationing. And I felt like saying, hello, what do we think we're talking about? There are a lot of ways you can ration, but I think that you can get by without making some tough decisions. And I've studied all the techniques, global caps and all sorts of things. All of them require somebody to give up something. The next chart, please. The dreaded our word or for rationing. It can either be implicit or explicit. It can be administrative and bureaucratic, or it can be market-oriented. And we've not begun to have a discussion of how we might reduce health care. Now, I started wondering, when did this huge expenditure of the United States on health care begin? Has it always been true? And I had not known this, that in 1965, just before Medicare, we were spending about the same amount on health care as a percent of the GDP that other developed countries were. Now look at where we are now. We're the highest in the world. And we spend about 5 or 6% of GDP more than the rest of the world on health care. I asked a bunch of people who know more than I do, how on earth did this come about? And they said, well, LBJ, we have a friend here who may remember this, was dying to have a domestic tranche to his legacy. And his Brahmin Kennedy friends, forgive the expression here, were thought of as the elite group, and he wanted to have his own legacy. And he decided Medicare was going to be it. But I'm told that his political stance was so attenuated because of Vietnam that he had to make some very major compromises. And we ended up with a system that no one else in the world has, because he had to buy off essentially the American Medical Association, the American Hospital Association. So we ended up with this very open-ended, high-cost, high-tech system. Now look at this next chart on costs. We spend more than twice as much per capita as the other developed countries. And I've searched for the evidence, but there's very little evidence that our health outcomes are twice as good as others. Now, I spend a lot of time in business, as do many of you. Most corporate businesses run their businesses on what is called best practices, and you find the highest productivity, highest output, lowest cost, and you apply those practices throughout the corporation. What about Medicare? Let's look at the next chart, please. You may be shocked if you don't do this, for these huge and otherwise unexplainable variations in treatments on healthcare across the country. For example, there are places in Oregon that have over 6 times the back surgery that places in Indiana do. There are places in Georgia that have over 6 times the prostate removal than places in Texas do. Now, I'm hard-pressed to believe that people's prostates and backs are fundamentally different in those 2 states. One has to conclude that it's the medical profession that is making those decisions in our society. Next chart, please. We spend much more on the end of life. And I tried to understand why. And one of the brightest people in this field that I know is Dr. Plum at New York Hospital, who headed neurology but was extremely interested in healthcare economics. And I said, Fred, help me explain why we're spending this much in your view. He said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to send you to the intensive care unit at New York Hospital, and you're a smart guy, and your vision is reasonably good. Why don't you just look around and observe what you see? Then I'm going to arrange for you to go to a London hospital, and you can look at the same phenomenon. Well, I was just astonished. The New York Hospital, at least, a very substantial percentage of the people were in their 80s, had had very severe strokes. Their quality of life was very limited. They were using heroic intervention techniques and so forth. I went to London and I found a very different demographic profile. So I came back and said, I think I know one of the reasons. Explain that to me. Well, he said, in Great Britain, if a person has a very debilitating stroke, and the odds of any quality of life are enormously limited, the patient is turned over to the general practitioner, who in turn sends them home. And they die the way people normally died in the old days. Now, I'm responsible for more people losing elections than anyone in this room, I'm sure. And Dick Lamb, John White's one of our directors, the Concord Coalition, ran in Colorado. And he said, can you think of a sensible proposal that might reduce these costs? So I thought I'd take one of my more gentle ones and said, why don't we have a requirement that everybody has a living will? So at least these decisions are taken up. So he says, see, that seems sensible to me. Why don't I try it? He lost the election by a big margin because he was called Dr. Death. Now, this gives you an idea of the difficulties of solving these problems. We also spend, next chart please, much more on high-tech, high-cost procedures. For example, I keep hearing about the Canadian system, and I've seen a half dozen studies. We have somewhere between 10 and 20 times more MRI units per capita than Canada does. So we have that issue to confront. Now, if we look at the next chart compared to the rest of the world, you can see that we spend much more on the elderly than the rest of the world does, by a margin of roughly 2 to 1. So my basic conclusion here is that Social Security is a much smaller problem, a much easier problem to solve, and we ought to fix it, because we're going to need all the resources anybody thought of to fix the healthcare problem. I've suggested to Alan Greenspan that, since he seems to be about the most respected man in America, that he could probably be doing a great service to this country, to head a major bipartisan commission. And I know people say, oh, just another commission, but I thought that 9/11 commission made quite an impact. And I think this problem is one that's going to require immense credibility from a bipartisan group. Next chart deals with current account deficits, the foreign deficits. And they are simply off the chart by anything we've ever thought of. The previous record was in the 80s, in the Reagan years, 3.45% of GDP, now nearly 7%, and it's widening by every account. We import over $6 billion now of foreign capital, nearly half of that, or more than, nearly half, to finance these deficits. Now, in the 1980s, the dollar fell by a third. We had other problems in our financial markets. It's now twice that level. So next chart, please. This has given rise to a huge debate about the so-called hard landing or soft landing. Everyone believes, at least the people I talk to, that this level of current account deficit is unsustainable. We had a Nixon humorist, which may strike some of you as an oxymoron, I don't know, named Herb Stein, who used to say, if something's unsustainable, it tends to stop. And one day he said, if you don't like that one, if your horse dies, I suggest you dismount. Now, we have a situation here in which we continue to ride this horse that's essentially not sustainable. Now, I interviewed for my last book 12 of the smartest people I know, smarter than I. About half of them believe we run very serious risks of hard landing. Paul Volcker, for example, not known, in fact, he's desperately known for constructive ambiguity, a great smoke blower of our times, as I keep telling him, actually said to me, I think there's a 75% chance of a hard landing in the next 5 years. He said, Pete, this is the most difficult and intractable problem that I have seen in a long time, and I've been around a long time. About half the people I talked to expect that. The other half expect a soft landing, but make no mistake about it, it's a landing, not a takeoff, where the dollar falls gradually and interest rates go up, more gradually. Next chart, please. We're depending a lot on foreign borrowing, and I thought you'd be interested in how much our expenditures are 35 years from now, project, compared to the rest of the world. And you can see that their expenditures, because their demographic problems are more serious than ours, are substantially larger than ours, and yet we're depending on them to, at least for much of what we're doing. Now, one book from me is one too many, if I can show the next chart. But for those of you who don't study demographics at all, let me just show you what's going on here on birth rates. Birth rates are extraordinarily important here because it's the young people, obviously, that pay the taxes. The United States expects to have a slight increase, partly because our birth rate is nearly 2.1 and because we have many more immigrants. But look at what's happening here in Italy and Japan and so forth. They're going to experience cuts of 20, 30, and 40% of their young people who are expected to pay the taxes. Next chart, please. Next thing to think about overseas is their payroll taxes are already much higher than ours. They're 41% in Germany, 43% in Italy, 50% in France, and 18% here. The overall tax load is much higher there than it is there, 45% versus 32%. I'm trying to make the point that they're going to have huge strains on their resources, and their problem is indeed very serious. Next chart, please. Only 7% of the continental Europeans have a pension, a company pension. About half of the Americans have a company pension. Moral, they depend very heavily on the public pensions in the rest of the world. Next chart, please. Finally, Europeans retire much earlier than we do. And you remember the Paris riots over the surgical terminal suggestion that retirement ages be raised from 55 to 58 or something, and there are riots in the streets. So I think the question that I pose on the next chart is, given the unsustainability of our current account deficits, should we be depending on these rapidly aging countries with plunging birth rates, with their own even larger demands for senior benefits, with earlier retirement, with very few company pensions, with very high taxes to finance part of our Triad deficits? Finally, the third deficit is the U.S. savings deficit. And I'm not an economist, as must be obvious, but I don't know an economist that doesn't lament the drop in the net national savings rate. And I thought you'd be interested in how much it has dropped, because we used to be among the biggest savers in the world. It's fallen from 11% of GDP 50 years ago, just over 3% now. Now, next chart. If we're to increase net national savings, there are two fundamental ways we have to do it, because corporate earnings are at high levels. We're either going to have to reduce the budget deficits or the dis-savings, and we're going to have to increase personal savings, in my view. Now, what has happened to personal savings? They have literally fallen off the chart. In July, we actually had a negative number. Look at where we were only 12 years ago. I told the dean that, again, one speech from me is really one too many, but I think a wonderful project for an interdisciplinary university like yours is to try to understand what were the forces that caused us to go from the biggest saver to the biggest consumer and borrower. They could be television forces, they could be Vietnam. I don't know what all the forces are, but I think it's well worth it, because one of the reasons I suggested you consider that is our lousy savings rate is related to our short-termitis, because it is a metaphor for the fact that we're not spending much time thinking about the future. Now, a lot of people say to me, well, people have got a lot of money in their homes and so forth. Most of the economists I talk to say what we need are usable savings, not savings that are locked up in homes. Now, next chart, please. The other thing that's happening is our debt service is at historically high levels. It's now the highest level it's been in 2 decades. Next chart, please. The households are more highly leveraged than any time in the post-World War II period. Energy costs, even at the previous levels of interest and energy, were consuming 20% of the disposable income. Household debt, next chart, is at extraordinary levels of percent of net worth. Some people tell me the average U.S. family is now spending about 22% more than it earns. They have 13 credit cards, $9,000 in credit card debt, which is twice as high as it was 10 years ago. You know that TV commercial you're seeing where the guy says, I got a 4-room bedroom house, I got a new car, I belong to the club, and on, how do I do it? And he said, I'm up to my neck in debt. And that's probably a pretty simple statement. Housing in particular is a metaphor for what's going on here. Let's look at the market. The next chart, the 30-year mortgage rate is now remarkably low versus 30-year averages, about 4.5% lower than it is over a 30-year period. But in spite of that, nearly 50%, next chart please, of the new mortgages are for adjustable rate. The Wall Street Journal says that 22% of the people in California, which is always ahead of the rest of us, wouldn't even qualify for a fixed rate mortgage. Next chart, please. 23% of these new applications are for interest-only floating rate. That number was far, far smaller not long ago. Again, a metaphor for something here. Next chart, please. An estimated 42% of first-time buyers of houses put down no down payment on their houses, all interest. Next chart, please. The median down payment is just 3%. It's down from 30% about 10% about 20 years ago. Next chart. Nearly 1 in 2 homes bought in 2004 were bought for investment or speculative purposes. It's a record high number. Next chart, please. By some accounts, and I'm not sure how they measure this, but 60% of the country is in a housing bubble. Now, presumably, the American people are making a couple of simple assumptions, that housing prices are going to go up and interest rates are going to remain low. Those are 2 assumptions that might get challenged as time goes on. Next chart, the residential housing is 55% higher in value than it was only 5 years ago. And 70% of the increase in net worth is housing. So people are assuming that this wonderful world is going to go on forever. Now, where are interest rates now? Next chart, please. The average 10-year Treasury is, as you can see, is 7.2% over the last 10 years. It's now 4.18%. It is at remarkably low levels. So the key question that we'd better start thinking about is, given that the households are highly leveraged and energy costs are exploding, with natural gas being twice what it was, with electricity rates next year expected to go up 20%, what would be the combined effects of an increase in interest rates and energy costs on consumer spending and the economy as a whole? All right, let me wrap up in the following way. What are some of my conclusions about what we need to think about? Number 1, I think every proposal that you look at should try to confront a simple question: does it increase national net savings? We talk a lot about outsourcing of jobs. We don't talk much about outsourcing of savings. Next chart. Reducing budget deficits, government dis savings is important, but much too little emphasis has been put on the long-term unsustainable structural deficits. Number 3, fundamental reform of our entitlement programs is absolutely required. Social Security, be sure, but Medicare is the far, far bigger problem, and our health care costs simply must be addressed soon. 4, while one cannot rule out tax increases, it is clear that entitlement benefit reductions will have to play the dominant role. 5, Social Security needs to be fixed, really fixed, and the possible solutions, at least to me, are far clearer than there are for Social Security. I would like to solve the Social Security problem without increasing taxes and without additional borrowing. 6, Social Security reform also presents an opportunity to meet a major national need to increase national and personal savings. And I believe, obviously, that a mandatory plan will help achieve that. 7, we must do everything possible to avoid a serious dollar crisis and a hard landing. To avoid such a landing, few things are more important than persuading foreign governments and foreign investors that America is getting its fiscal economic house in order. That means we, as a country, must stop spending more than we earn and instead consume and import relatively less and export and save relatively more. 8, the other countries of the world must confront the brute fact that they can no longer depend on U.S. exports to drive their domestic economies. They, in turn, must consume and import relatively more if we and they are to address the unsustainable global imbalance that confronts our economy. 9, redressing this global imbalance, this dysfunctional dependence will require fundamental and difficult changes in the economics, the culture, and the politics of us and the rest of the world. And finally, genuine bipartisan leadership will be required. And in this all-gain and no-pain short-term next election crisis-oriented society, this is a very tall order. Thank you very much.
We have microphones down in the first floor here and here, and 2 up above. I'm going to take the Dean's discretion here and ask the first question. Your book is called Running on Empty. I forgot to mention what came after the colon. It's called How the Democratic and Republican Parties Are Bankrupting Our Future. So how are they bankrupting? What are the Republican and Democratic parties doing to bankrupt America? What do you mean by that?
I'm looking at Malcolm and wondering whether he's saying, my God, what was I doing recommending this character? I have a self-destructive need to offend everyone, so I have attacked what I call in my book the theologies of both parties. And as a lifelong Republican, it's rather difficult to say. But I use the word theologies deliberately because in the case of my party in particular, a lot of our policies seem to be theological, faith-directed, relatively untouched by analysis or evidence or history. And because they're faith-directed, they are delivered with a kind of moral certitude that makes it very difficult to have a rational debate. For example, my party has many members that have adopted a tax cut theology. Any tax cut, any time, and we'll grow out of it, and so forth. And then we have a new group in the Republican Party that are in a conspiracy, I guess, of sorts with the rest of the party. And they're called the big government Republicans, which is kind of a oxymoron, at least it used to be. Discretionary non-defense spending has grown about 8% annually over the last 4 years at record levels. Now, this isn't just me saying this, but my party did away with spending caps, it did away with pay-as-you-go, and Bill Clinton had agreed to those measures in a bipartisan way. Now, because this can sound awfully hostile to my own party, I'm going to quote some conservatives within the party. The Cato Institute, hardly a liberal Eastern establishment institution, calls it a spending explosion. Dick Armey, the former House Majority Leader, said we can't pin this one on the Democrats. We're in charge of everything here. John McCain calls this the biggest spending binge in his 22 years in Congress. He said, first you condemn it, then you condone it, finally you embrace it. Now, the third branch of the Republican Party are another kind of theological group that I've debated called Starve the Beasters. And their rationale is totally different from the supply-siders. Their rationale is, of course, if you cut taxes, you're going to cut revenues. And that's what I want, because then we can get rid of all these damn social programs. I've had debates with these people, and the debate goes something like this. Sir, have you considered that 1/3 of the people at retirement have no savings at all? Have you considered that for the bottom fifth of the American public at retirement, they depend on Social Security for 91% of their income? And I want you to picture this scene. We got 78 million boomers, twice as many as we have now, politically organized, you know. And you're going to say to them some happy day, sorry folks, we're going to have a big cut in benefits. And they are going to say, thank you. I deserve that for my profligacy, if I understand what you're saying. And I say to them, by the way, if you're so concerned about reducing the size of government, why don't you come up with proposals for reducing, which they haven't. And if I may be permitted one more, by the way, I'm troubled by the fact that our president is the first president since John Quincy Adams not to veto a single bill. And had he had convictions about spending, he had plenty of opportunities, it seems to me, to do something about it. Now to my former friends in the Democratic Party, because as I said, I'm an equal opportunity basher, I said, tell me, my party hasn't seen a tax cut it didn't like. You don't seem to have ever seen an entitlement program you don't want to create or expand. I said, you seem to ignore the question, if we're all on the wagon, who's going to pull it? And I think it's fair to say that the Democrats have been the most important movers of an enormous explosion in federal benefits. They've gone up about 6 times after inflation in the last 40 years. Now, it seems to me that if you look at the behavior on the recent Medicare prescription drug bill, the main criticism of most Democratic friends I have is the bill doesn't go far enough. So I think both parties have kind of adopted a very pragmatic theology. That we're going to win the election at any cost, and let's ship the bill to our children. So I think they're both to blame for the fiscal predicament that I described.
Starting right here, let me just say that quickly that these are questions. Each person should ask one question. A question has 3 characteristics. It starts with your name, it is short, and it ends with a question mark.
And easy to answer, right?
My name is Chris Gay, and I'm an MPA student here. There is, of course, a more sanguine view in the world about one of the deficits that you discussed tonight, and that is the current account deficit. And I wondered if I might just take 30 seconds to read Arthur Laffer's view of this, and some of you must have heard this type of argument before, but just to get your response to it. Very quick, yes. He says that, to paraphrase, in an era of floating exchange rates, current account deficit is one and the same as a capital surplus. The only way the U.S. can have a trade deficit, amounting to whatever percentage of GDP it is if foreigners invest that amount of their capital in the U.S. It's a matter of simple accounting. But once you realize that the trade deficit is, in fact, the capital surplus, you would clearly rather have capital lined up on our borders trying to get into the country than trying to get out. Growth countries, like growth companies, borrow money, and the U.S. is the only the only growth country of all the developed countries. As a result, we're a capital magnet. So in short, is the current account deficit something we should be all that worried about, or is it more a virtue than a problem?
Well, again, I'm not an economist. My answer will probably confirm that. I've tried to imagine a world in which we run 7% of the current account deficits for the next 10 or 20 years. And what would happen to our debt levels as a percent of the GDP to foreigners. And I think you would find that the debt service costs would be quite extraordinary. Now, I'm not looking for other people not to want to invest in the United States. I'm just saying that it would be great if a lot of it were for investment, but an enormous amount of it is not for investment. It's for consumption, basically. So I think that's what I'm saying. We're going to have to reduce our levels of consumption, and I think that importantly means government spending, most of which is for consumption.
Thank you.
Right up here.
Pavan Ahluwalia from the MPA ID program. I was just curious. I think you did a great job of summarizing a lot of the problems very well. But on the fiscal deficit issue, there is a view that's held by a lot of people, notably Paul Krugman, that one solution would just be, increase taxes. And what's wrong with looking like a good European country like, say, Britain, where you have higher taxes in the US, but still enough to kind of keep the growth momentum going, and we just spread it all a little more equally.
Well, Paul and I and Glenn Hubbard, who's Dean of the Business School, had a little debate on Harper's Magazine along this line. One of the things I admire greatly about Paul, he's very honest. I've given you some of the numbers on what the tax increases would have to be. And as unpalatable as some of the spending reforms might be, with the tax cut mania that exists in this country, how do you think politically the public would react to payroll taxes that are doubled. I just find it an extraordinarily difficult concept to imagine politically. Furthermore, I wish we would get to the net national savings point that I keep emphasizing. And to get there, I think we have to reduce the savings of the budget deficit. So that's my point of view, at least.
Right up here.
Hi, my name is Praveen, second year MPID student here. My question is, you gave a lot of solutions for fixing the Social Security problem, but what is your view on immigration policy as a solution? Because there's a lot of influx of high wage earners coming into the US.
Did you say immigration?
Yeah, immigration policy as a tool to fix the Social Security problem.
Well, John White remembers these numbers too. I've had a study made by the Concord Coalition of how much immigration would have to go up to just resolve the Social Security problem, never mind Medicare. I think it would have to increase by 5 times. And speaking of political realities, and keep in mind that doesn't solve the problem long term, but it does over the shorter term. I wonder what the political realities are of quintupling immigration. I would suggest less enthusiastic than you might think. So I don't, while I'm all for immigration, and thank God for this country, imagine that you were in Italy, losing 50% of your workforce over the next 40 years. And your option is to increase immigration by many more times than 5 and have a lot of them be Muslims after what's happened in France. So I have nothing against immigration, but I don't think immigration can begin to solve the fiscal problems. Thank God we have it, because with our birth rate, as I indicate, it's going to keep our labor force growing. But I think it's far from a complete solution.
Right over here.
My name is Ned Tebbets. I have a graduate degree from the Kennedy School. And in common with Mr. Peterson, I also have a degree from MIT in 1946. My career was as an actuary, a fellow of the Society of Actuaries, working closely with the Social Security Administration. I'm concerned in your presentation that you have lacked specifics as you've focused on the need for substantial rise in taxation and substantial cuts in some entitlement programs. But can you be more specific as to where some of those tax increases might come?
Let me be clear. On Social Security, I thought I said I'm against raising payroll taxes there and I'm against borrowing. I'm for doing it essentially by reducing benefits. I think some combination of what Bob Posen is talking about, which is reducing the wage indexing, but leaving it the same as it is now for the poor, and thinking of doing something on gradually increasing the retirement age, for example, is a much better way to go on Social Security than increasing taxes. If you did those two things, you would essentially solve the Social Security problem.
Hi, Brian Copperell in mid-career. I remember many years ago, and you alluded to Oregon, that that process of going through selecting 550 out of 718 procedures that would be funded by Medicaid. Can you bring us up to date on where Oregon stands, and does it present an opportunity at the Medicare level?
Well, I haven't done a study of it, John. Maybe you have. I think if you talk to any governor, they'll tell you that the Medicaid costs, I think in New York, are 40% of the budget now. And Medicaid, I would include Medicare, is a horrendous cost. And the reason it's getting a lot of attention is the states pay half of it. And the states, unlike the government, are not in this wonderful position of just printing bonds. And because many of them have requirements to balance their budget. So Medicaid costs are a very serious problem for the states at the present time. Very.
This will be the last question right up here.
Thanks very much for coming to our school. My name's Nicholas Kukrik. I'm in the MPP program. And you mentioned that politicians have a sort of allergic reaction to delivering the bad news, and obviously very few have delivered the kinds of bad news that you've delivered tonight. How would you suggest to future leaders and people who hope to go into government that they deliver this bad news? What tips or practical suggestions would you give to us on how to actually win an election while talking about these things?
Very simple, isn't it, John? You joined the Concord Coalition, right? Right? Is that the right message? Yeah. I just spoke to the business school. And some bright person like you raised the question, is what can they do? And I said, I think you ought to look in the mirror as young people, because it's your future we're talking about. It's your taxes, it's your debt, and so forth. And I said, you kids remind me, based on your voting behavior and your lack of involvement, on the kid, that is in the back of the philosophy class and the professor says to him, which is worse, ignorance or apathy? And some kid from the back said, I don't know and I don't care, Well, we have a political system in which the young vote far less. You are competing. I'm looking at you now in your generation. And you've got 35 million members of the American Association of Retired Persons. They've never met a benefit increase they didn't want. I'm one of their folk heroes, obviously, in American life. We had an experience for President Clinton's Entitlement Reform Commission that was set up with Bob Kerrey and Jack Danforth. The head of programs or something, ARP, is there. We insisted they testify. And we had just concluded unanimously that these programs were utterly unsustainable. So the purpose of the inquiry is, what are we going to do about it? And this fellow gives this testimony, and he gives 10 suggestions for benefit increases. So I'm Ellen Simpson, who used to be here, was sitting to the left of me. And Alan, as you know, is very provocative on this subject. He just adored the American Association of Retired Persons. And he said, why don't you hit him high and I'll hit him low? So I hit him low. I said, we have just decided unanimously that the program is unsustainable, the two major programs, the way they are. And we're going to have to do something about it. And you have just listed 10 new benefit increases that would dramatically increase the problem. Why don't you talk about how you're going to pay for this? And his answer was, well, that's a subject worthy of some discussion. So I said, fine, we're on television. Why don't we have a discussion right here? What exactly are you proposing? And the answer was nothing. So keep in mind that you kids are confronting a political world with 35 million members in the American Association of Retired Persons. They're paying dues, they write letters, they vote much more than you do, and they're much more active in the political process. I'll never forget, on another project I was on, going in to visit Congressman Kent Hance, who was the House member responsible for budgets or something. And as you probably know, the federal pensions, which incidentally are all off budget and far more generous than the private sector, really ought to be looked at, because it's kind of a stealth activity at the present time. And I said, sir, I think you really ought to look at your indexing system, because I don't know of a single corporation that has 100% indexing. So there are several ways you could reform it. So I really was being had. He pushes a button and says to his assistant, why don't you bring in all the letters proposing that under no circumstances should we change the indexing? And this poor assistant says, you mean all of them? He says, no, just bring some of them. This poor person walks in with a huge armful of letters and says, well, thank you very much. Now, why don't you bring in the letters from people proposing reform of the indexing? The person says, we've never gotten a letter like that. So this is the problem. The arithmetic of the politics are very, very daunting. And you kids have to get educated about what's happening to your future. Hell, I'm a fat cat. I'm in great shape. Malcolm's in great shape. I think, yeah. He has paid his, yeah, okay, good. I'm deeply relieved. Now, I'm often asked by people, are you saying that the parents in this country and the grandparents don't care about their kids? And I said, no, that is not what I'm saying. I'm saying they have been anesthetized by a bunch of political Valium that doesn't tell them what the truth is. And if they believe that the Social Security Trust Fund is solvent for 40 years, why should they get upset? So I look at the kids in this country and I say, part of your job is to get very educated about your own implications of what I'm trying to talk about on your future. And then have a real dialogue with your parents. Because I don't think they would consciously slip you the check for their free lunch. And then you have to get involved politically in ways that the young people have never been involved. That's my view of what you should be doing at the present time. And like most of my advice to my
You have been true to your word. You have attacked Democrats and Republicans. You have attacked the young and the old.
and the rich.
And so I do suspect that you are not going to follow in Herbert Hoover's footsteps, but I sure wish you would, because there's an awful lot of wisdom and truth here, and part of what we have to do is figure out a way to make sure that those ideas are taken seriously. So thank you very much for your time. Have a safe evening.
Excellent, great, excellent.